August 25th, 1941, 0310 hours, east of Novgorod-Seversky on the Desna River. Colonel Ivan Mikhailovich Sokolov stood in a soaked trench beside the command dugout of his rifle regiment, listening to the ominous sound carrying through the night, the low, rising rumble of engines moving fast across the western horizon. Not Soviet, not retreating Red Army remnants. These were German engines, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their synchronized movement cutting through the night air like a drill. A forward observer reported that at 0240 hours he had seen headlights, brief flashes through the trees, along a forest track 5 kilometers southwest of the regiment's position. That track, according to Soviet maps, was supposed to be impassable to vehicles, yet the Germans were on it. Sokolov checked his pocket watch. He had sent a runner an hour earlier to Corps headquarters requesting permission to pull back his regiment and the 2 attached battalions behind the Desna. No answer. Corps HQ had gone silent sometime after midnight, their radio transmissions dissolving into static and clipped fragments. The only orders Sokolov still had were the last written instructions from the previous afternoon. Hold positions at all costs. At 0312 hours, a flash of artillery fire lit the sky to the west. A second flash followed. Moments later, 150mm shells began to land along the Soviet main line of resistance. Sokolov ducked as a blast showered dirt across the trench. The bombardment intensified in seconds. He could hear men shouting, ammunition boxes tipping over, splinters tearing into dugouts. The German barrage was not exploratory. It was the opening strike of an encirclement. He called over his operations officer. "Report?" he asked, shouting to be heard over the explosions. "Forward battalion's holding, but the right flank is collapsing. Spotters say German armored cars are already in the woods behind us." That confirmed it. The Germans had bypassed the Soviet positions overnight. Likely elements of the 3rd Panzer Division or 1st Panzer Division, units advancing at speeds the Red Army still struggled to comprehend. If those armored cars reached the river crossings before sunrise, Sokolov's entire regiment, 7,000 men of his own command, plus another 8,000 from the neighboring units relying on his sector, would be trapped on the eastern bank with no way out. At 0318 hours, a new sound joined the artillery, the rapid, brutal chatter of MG-34 machine guns. German infantry was moving in behind the bombardment. Sokolov knew his situation. Orders demanded he hold. Reality demanded he run. He lowered the field telephone receiver onto its hook. Corps' headquarters still did not answer. Stavka directives issued the previous week had been brutal. Any commander retreating without explicit permission would face a tribunal. Rumors of generals arrested, colonels shot, and commissars executing officers on the roadside were common. But there was no time left to wait for permission. The Germans would seal the river crossings in less than 2 hours. At Zoros 320 hours, Sokolov issued the order he knew could end his career or his life. Prepare immediate withdrawal to the east bank. Destroy heavy equipment that cannot move. Regroup at phase line Burin by dawn. His staff froze. One major stared in disbelief. A young commissar opened his mouth to protest. Sokolov silenced him with a look sharpened by exhaustion and absolute clarity. "We leave now," he said, "or we die here." No more debate. The first companies began pulling back at 0322 hours. By then, the German barrage was beginning to walk eastward, targeting the Soviet rear areas, supply wagons, field kitchens, ammunition stacks. Black columns of smoke rose into the night. The Desna crossings were still 12 kilometers away, and a column of 15,000 men, riflemen, sappers, medics, cooks, artillery crews, was beginning a retreat in darkness. Sokolov knew the Germans would not give them long. The colonel also knew Stalin's orders forbade retreat under any circumstances. But as the night lit with artillery fire and the engine noise drew closer, one conclusion was unavoidable. If he obeyed orders, his men would be surrounded by morning. If he disobeyed, they might live. And the Red Army, still reeling from weeks of catastrophic losses, could not afford to lose 15,000 more. The choice was made. The path that led to this moment and the consequences that followed began weeks earlier on the collapsing front of Ukraine, where Stalin's rigid orders collided with German mobility, where Soviet formations died, waiting for permission to save themselves, and where one colonel decided he would not let that happen again. Colonel Ivan Mikhailovich Sokolov had been a career officer in the Red Army since the early 1920s. A veteran of the Civil War's final stages, he had risen through the ranks by emphasizing discipline, logistical organization, and defensive engineering. By 1941, he commanded the 459th Rifle Regiment of the 169th Rifle Division, an understrength formation positioned south of Gomel, tasked with defending a sector of the Desna River line. In theory, the regiment was supposed to field 3,000 men. In reality, after weeks of chaotic retreat, partial encirclements, and constant Luftwaffe harassment, it numbered around 2,400 effective riflemen, supported by 2 battalions of attached reservists and remnants from other shattered units. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Western Front disintegrated within days. German Army Group Center advanced with unprecedented speed, sometimes 30 to 50 kilometers per day, supported by Luftwaffe bombers that targeted Soviet convoys, rail junctions, and bridges. The 459th Rifle Regiment had been in reserve at the time, positioned to respond to breakthroughs. But the scale of the German attack was beyond anything Sokolov or his fellow officers had anticipated. Soviet defensive lines collapsed before reserves could be deployed. Communications failed. Divisions vanished from the map. By July 5th, Sokolov's regiment was already retreating east, burned by constant rearguard actions. They had encountered German armored spearheads several times, usually in sudden, violent engagements lasting less than an hour. The regiment lost its entire anti-tank battery in the first week, when German panzers flanked them through a marsh previously designated impassable terrain. That lesson, never assume a map's limitations in the face of German mobility, stayed with Sokolov. Throughout early July, the regiment fought delaying actions, destroyed bridges, felled trees across roads, and abandoned supply dumps to slow the German advance. But they were always outpaced. Luftwaffe reconnaissance patrols spotted their columns, Stuka dive bombers attacked them at will, and German motorized infantry used secondary roads Soviet commanders had dismissed as unsuitable. During these weeks, Sokolov witnessed the consequences of refusing to retreat without permission. On July 8th, the 216th Rifle Regiment, positioned to Sokolov's north, had held its ground under strict orders despite German armored thrusts, bypassing both flanks. By July 10th, that regiment was surrounded. It attempted a breakout on July 11th, but German machine gun nests and artillery caught them in open fields. Only about 400 of its original 2,800 soldiers reached Soviet lines. Their colonel was court-martialed in absentia for unauthorized withdrawal, despite having died in the breakout attempt. Such contradictions, punished for retreating, punished for staying, were common across the Western Front. Stalin's Directive No. 270, issued in August 1941, but anticipated in the rhetoric of earlier orders, demanded officers fight to the last man. Any withdrawal without explicit written permission risked charges of cowardice or treason. Sokolov understood the intent: prevent panic, enforce discipline, but he also understood the consequences. The directive did not account for German mobility or the catastrophic state of Soviet communications or the impossibility of controlling huge, uncoordinated fronts, while half the army lacked functioning radios. By July, encirclement disasters were piling up: Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, each costing the Red Army hundreds of thousands of men. Sokolov feared his regiment would be next. The Desna River line, where he was ordered to hold in August, was supposed to be a stable anchor point. The river was wide, its banks steep. Bridges could be blown to delay pursuit, but the front was collapsing elsewhere. Reports came in that the Germans had crossed the Dnieper near Chernihiv. Other reports mentioned German armored scouts near the town of Korop, far behind what should have been secure lines. Soviet staff officers dismissed these as exaggerations or misidentified partisan movements, but Sokolov trusted his instincts and his maps. The roads the Germans could use were few, but those few roads were exposed and poorly defended. By August 10th, the Desna line was under attack. German artillery opened fire across multiple sectors. Panzer divisions probed the river crossings. Soviet defenses held for a time. The 459th Rifle Regiment repelled several crossing attempts using Maxim machine guns, mortar teams, and a dwindling supply of rifle grenades. Casualties were heavy, but manageable. The regiment even counterattacked once, retaking a small village that served as a forward staging area. But on August 17th, Sokolov received intelligence that 6th Army, commanded by Field Marshal von Reichenau, was pushing south, while 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by Guderian, was sweeping northeast. This was not a local threat. This was an operational envelopment forming across the entire northern Ukraine front. The 169th Rifle Division, to which Sokolov belonged, was instructed to hold its ground. Division headquarters insisted that reinforcements were on the way, but none arrived. Soviet mechanized corps that might have counterattacked had been annihilated weeks earlier or reduced to fragments of their former strength. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining tanks. Air reconnaissance was nearly non-existent due to ongoing Luftwaffe dominance. By August 20th, Sokolov's regiment was already short on ammunition. Some companies had only 15-20 rounds per man. Mortar tubes were worn. Machine gun belts were almost empty. The regiment still held its positions, but its ability to resist a concentrated German attack was diminishing rapidly. Then came the reports that changed everything. On August 23rd, forward scouts spotted German armored cars on a forest road west of the regiment's position, far behind what should have been German lines. That afternoon, a captured German courier revealed, under interrogation, documents suggesting that multiple German spearheads were moving to seal an encirclement around Soviet forces along the Desna and Dnieper. The timing matched perfectly with Guderian's thrust toward Konotop and Romny. Sokolov immediately sent a request for permission to withdraw behind the river crossings. The request disappeared into the scattered, chaotic radio nets of the collapsing front. He received no response. On August 24th, a neighboring battalion on his right flank was overrun by German infantry supported by panzers. Survivors reported German forces moving behind Soviet lines, cutting off secondary routes. Corps headquarters insisted it was a local penetration and that all units must hold at all costs. Sokolov did not believe them. He reviewed his maps late into the night. The Desna crossings behind his regiment were the only escape routes for at least 15,000 Soviet troops in the sector. If the Germans reached those crossings first, all of those troops would be trapped. With German armored columns already spotted, maneuvering on forest roads' time was running out, which led directly to the moment described in the opening, the artillery barrage at 03:10 hours on August 25th, the sound of German engines moving fast, the realization that the encirclement was closing, and the moment when Sokolov made his decision. He would retreat without orders, against orders, to save his men. What followed over the next 4 hours would determine whether those 15,000 soldiers lived or died, whether they escaped or were captured, whether the colonel was remembered as a traitor, a coward, or the officer who saved an entire sector from annihilation. At 03:25 hours, as the withdrawal order rippled across company lines, Sokolov moved to the forward trench network to supervise the first phase personally. The regiment would retreat in 3 echelons: forward battalions first, support companies next, headquarters and heavy weapons last. It was not ideal, it was not even doctrinal, but doctrine had died days ago. What mattered now was speed, silence, and discipline under fire. The first Soviet companies began slipping out of their trenches at 03:27 hours, moving east in staggered formations across open ground broken by shell craters. German artillery continued battering their former positions, unaware the Soviets were evacuating. A string of explosions lit the sky behind the withdrawing columns. 105 millimeters and 115 shells that would have annihilated them had they obeyed orders to stay. At 03:35 hours, German reconnaissance patrols, likely elements of 3rd Panzer Division, made contact with Soviet rearguards on the regiment's western edge. Light armored cars opened fire with 20mm autocannons, their tracer rounds streaking across the night. Sokolov ordered the rearguard to delay the Germans for 10 minutes, no more. They fought skillfully, using mortars and anti-tank rifles to pin the armored cars, then slipped away under cover of darkness. The Germans pushed forward rapidly, but the regiment's main body was already 2 kilometers east. By 03:45 hours, the scale of the retreat became clear. The regiment's retreat path was merging with that of 2 neighboring units, the 513th Rifle Regiment and remnants of the 73rd Artillery Battalion. Columns interwove chaotically in the dark, horses whinnying, carts creaking, men stumbling across uneven ground. Yet, despite the confusion, the movement continued. Soviet soldiers understood implicitly what their commanders could not say aloud. They were fleeing an encirclement. At 03:52 hours, Sokolov received a runner from the engineer detachment ahead. The bridge at Novgorod-Seversky was still intact, but German armored scouts had been spotted approaching the western bank. He had less than 90 minutes, perhaps less, to move 15,000 men across the Desna before the Germans sealed the crossing. The colonel ordered the pace increased. Tired soldiers jogged through the night, rifles slung over shoulders, breath forming white clouds in the cold. Officers shouted to maintain formation. Sokolov himself ran alongside the lead battalion for several minutes, urging them forward. His presence steadied the men. They knew he was disobeying direct orders. They also sensed that no one else would have risked it. At 04:05 hours, the sky lit again, this time eastward. German artillery had begun targeting the bridge approaches. Sokolov cursed under his breath. The Germans were aiming blind, but they knew the Soviets needed the crossing. A lucky hit could collapse the entire retreat. He ordered the 3rd Battalion to form a fire screen along a small ridge overlooking the western approach. Machine guns were set up, mortars placed behind them, riflemen spread along the slope. They would buy time for the rest of the column. At 04:02 hours, German armored cars reached the western bridgehead. Their headlights flashed briefly before they were extinguished. Discipline even in pursuit. MG-34 fire erupted across the river, sweeping the Soviet rearguard positions. Mortar rounds responded instantly, bursting among the German scouts. Sokolov knew the Germans would not wait for infantry. Panzers were already on the way. At 04:20 hours, the 1st Tauchpanzer IV, modified for river fording, appeared behind the German scouts. Its silhouette was unmistakable even in the uneven glow of artillery bursts. It opened fire across the river, shells smashing into the Soviet side. The bridge shuddered under impacts. One shell collapsed a wooden cart packed with medical supplies. But by now, Sokolov's lead companies had reached the bridge. Thousands of men began crossing, stepping onto wooden planks, slick with dew and mud. Engineers directed traffic, keeping gaps between units to prevent overcrowding. The river below churned in the darkness. At over 430 hours, the Germans escalated. Two Panzer III tanks rumbled up beside the Tauchpanzer IV, their 50mm guns firing rapidly. Machine gun teams deployed along the riverbank. The German objective was clear: suppress the Soviet rearguard and begin direct fire onto the bridge itself. At 0436 hours, a German artillery battery, likely positioned 3 kilometers west, registered the Soviet crossing. A shell struck the eastern bridge ramp, blowing a crater into the roadway. Men stumbled, fell, scrambled back to their feet. The engineers struggled to repair the damage under fire. A second shell landed near the riverbank, sending fragments through an ammunition wagon. Sokolov sprinted to the engineer's position, grabbed a corporal by the shoulder, and shouted over the din, "Patch it! 2 minutes, no more!" The corporal nodded and ran. By 0440 hours, half the Soviet force had crossed the river, nearly 7,000 men. The rest were still east of the woods, moving toward the bridge in a long, snaking column. German artillery intensified further. Shells bracketed the crossing, first short, then long, walking closer with each salvo. At 0448 hours, the German armor attempted a direct assault. 3 Panzer IIIs and 1 Tauchpanzer IV advanced to within 300 meters of the western bank, firing into the Soviet rearguard. Sokolov's 3rd Battalion responded with a concentrated volley of anti-tank rifle fire and grenades. Though ineffective at long range, the volume of fire forced the German tanks to button up and maneuver cautiously. Mortars dropped smoke shells to obscure Soviet positions, but smoke bought only minutes. At 0455 hours, German infantry began deploying assault boats, rubber rafts carried by pioneer units. Their intention was unmistakable: a rapid crossing to seize the eastern bank before the Soviets escaped. Sokolov ordered the last reserve he had left, the 2nd Battalion, to counterattack. These men, exhausted from marching all night, fixed bayonets and advanced down the slope toward the riverbank under cover of darkness and smoke. They collided with the German pioneers at close range, forcing several rafts to overturn. Machine gun fire rattled across the river. Dozens fell, Soviet and German, but the German crossing attempt stalled. At 0501 hours, the eastern sky began to brighten. Dawn was approaching, and dawn would expose every movement. Sokolov needed the rest of his men across before the first full light. He moved to the bridge entrance, waving the last companies through. Soldiers passed him with hollow eyes, some limping, some carrying wounded comrades between them. Behind them, wagons creaked, artillery crews hauled their last surviving 70-centimeter field guns by hand, medics pushed carts laden with stretchers. At 0510 hours, Corps headquarters finally transmitted a message. Crackling, fragmentary, almost unintelligible. The meaning, however, was unmistakable. Hold positions. Withdrawal. Not authorized. Sokolov ignored it. He tore the receiver from its hook and shouted new orders to his regiment. All remaining units, cross now. At 0520 hours, the Germans brought up heavier assets. An 80mm flak gun, dragged into position during the night, opened fire on the bridge. The first shot struck the central support beam. The bridge rattled violently. The second shot punched through the roadway, creating a splintered hole meters wide. Soviet soldiers scrambled around the gap. The engineers rushed forward again, this time using planks from a destroyed wagon to patch the roadway temporarily. At 0530 hours, the last Soviet rifle companies reached the crossing. German fire intensified. Mortars from the western bank pounded the eastern slope. Machine guns swept the approaches. The rearguard fought ferociously, firing every remaining round by seconds, just seconds, for the men still moving. At 0537 hours, the engineers reported the central supports were failing. The bombardment had weakened the structure beyond repair. They estimated 5 minutes before collapse. Sokolov ordered the 3rd Battalion to withdraw. These were the men who had held the Germans at bay for over an hour. Many sprinted across the bridge under direct fire. Others carried wounded comrades. Some crawled. The Germans stepped up their fire again, shells landing with lethal accuracy near both entrances. At 0542 hours, the bridge began to sag. Sokolov stood at the eastern end, rifle in hand, waving the last platoon across. A shell exploded to his left, throwing him to the ground. Dizzy, bleeding from his forehead, he pushed himself up and continued shouting. 2 sergeants grabbed him and dragged him toward the eastern bank. At 0545 hours, with the final men across, the last engineer lit the demolition fuse. He saluted Sokolov, then ran. Seconds later, the charges detonated. The bridge collapsed into the Desna in a massive splash of wood, metal, and smoke. A cheer rippled weakly through the Soviet ranks on the eastern bank. They had made it. 15,000 men, riflemen, sappers, gunners, medics, cooks, and staff, escaped encirclement. They would fight again. They would reinforce positions farther east. They would live. Sokolov stood unsteadily, watching the river carry the burning debris downstream. He knew the cost: dozens dead, hundreds wounded, equipment lost. He also knew what awaited him. At 6:10 hours, a political officer approached. His face was drawn, pale. He spoke quietly. "Colonel, headquarters demands your presence. They say you disobeyed direct orders." Sokolov responded without hesitation. "I saved the army." He was arrested on the spot. But something unexpected happened. 3 days later, as the front stabilized further east, divisional staff began receiving reports. 439th Regiment saved intact due to decisive action of Colonel Sokolov. Other commanders, seeing what had occurred, submitted formal statements. Survivors from artillery units crediting their escape to the colonel. Engineers testifying that without his orders, thousands would have died. By September 5th, Stalin himself was informed of the incident. The Soviet leader, constantly balancing terror and pragmatism, understood the significance. The Red Army could not afford to lose experienced regiments to pointless encirclement. The charges were quietly dropped. Colonel Ivan Mikhailovich Sokolov returned to command 11 days later. He would lead again, at times brilliantly, at times brutally, through the harshest years of the war. The lesson of his defiance echoed through the ranks. Orders can hold a line, but judgment saves armies. Systems win wars when individuals choose survival over obedience to destruction. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.